What's up everyone, and thank you for stopping by the channel. Today's project is this Honda lawnmower, and the problem is that the engine makes a terrible clanking noise when running, but I think I have the perfect solution. Let's take a good look at it, find out what's wrong with it, and hopefully we can fix it. In this video, we try and repair this mower. However, it may not be the exact repair you need to make to yours. We'll explore other options later in the video. In the last video on this mower, we finally got it running after doing some badly needed maintenance. However, we soon discovered that the engine was knocking rather badly. It's so bad that you can even hear it knocking without the engine even running. Now the reason why this happened was it was ran low on oil for a very long time, and the governor was adjusted so the engine would run faster than it was supposed to. So we had to make a decision to either rebuild this engine or replace it. Fortunately, I was able to find a used engine online for only $40, which is a much better investment than rebuilding the old one. That means to save this mower, we're going to do an engine swap. To begin, we're going to drain all the fluids so we don't make a huge mess. Now, while I was looking at the engine stickers, I finally realized that the size of the engine, which is 160 cc's, was actually cast into it, which is something I never really noticed. This will be important later on when we do the swap. So this is the used engine, and other than the way the top cover looks, it's pretty much the same engine. The only thing that's obvious about it is that it's missing the carburetor, so we're going to have to reuse the one we have already. The other problem that's not so obvious is the recoil assembly. If you pull on the rope, it's slow to return, which was the exact same problem that our original engine had as well. Now, we already fixed the issue on our original recoil, so we're going to use that one instead of trying to fix this one. This is when I noticed a big difference with the used engine. As you can see, the casting on the block shows that this is the larger 186cc engine. Now, our mower came with the smaller engine, so this should give us better performance, just so long as there's nothing wrong with it. This was actually a nice surprise, and although I wasn't planning on doing a big block swap, I guess that's what we have on our hands now. Next, I'll take off the parts that we won't be using. Now, before I commit to installing this engine on the deck, I want to do my usual testing to make sure that the engine is in working condition. The first thing I want to do is check to make sure that it has spark. Now, you could use a spark tester like this one, which can be bought online for a couple of dollars, but it's not necessary. You can do the same test using the original plug, it's just harder to see. First, remove the plug and then put it back on its wire, then lay it on a metal part of the engine. You'll also need to disconnect the ground wire from the coil, then turn the engine over and watch for sparks at the tip of the plug. So there was spark at the tip of the plug, and that means we have a working ignition system. If you didn't see sparks during your test, then you might have to reset the air gap for the coil to the magnets on the flywheel, and if that doesn't work, then you might have a bad coil. Now, while the spark plug is out of the engine, I want to use my compression tester to see if the engine is worn out. You can find these online for less than $20, and to use it, just install it into the spark plug hole and turn the engine over to get a reading. We want to see a reading well over 100 psi, and the higher the better. We do not want to see a reading less than 50, and since I'm using a drill to turn the engine over, the compression release won't be in the way to give us a low reading. So the reading is 165 psi, which is very impressive for a used engine. That means that this engine is healthy and we should not have any issues using it. The last thing I want to do is try a test start to make sure that it does run. I'll just add some gas into the engine, replace the plug and the wire, and then turn the engine over and see if it runs for a second. Well, I guess I should have secured the engine to the frame so it doesn't try and rotate, but at least we know that it does start and run. So it looks like we got a very good used engine for our $40, and that means we can start removing the original one from the deck. I didn't show it, but the gas tank was already empty, but if yours has gas in it, you might want to drain it out. One thing I did not mention is that the used engine also had a clutch assembly on it. However, in the first video in the series, we already serviced this clutch assembly with new bearings, so I want to use this one instead. The other thing is, I'm not sure if the used engine's clutch assembly was even working, but I'm not going to worry about it just yet. Later on, if we need to use the other assembly or the recoil, we'll take a closer look at it and then service them if we need to. The one thing I like about these engines is that the bolts that hold it to the deck are not likely to break like other engines that use triangular shaped bolts. Even though that's the case, I still want to be careful when removing these bolts. Once the engine is off the deck, we can then remove the carburetor so we can put it on the used engine. Now I know this carb is in working condition, but I do want to take a look inside just to make sure I don't see any corrosion or trash inside the bowl. Now these carbs are very inexpensive to replace with aftermarket ones, which I have found to be very reliable, so if we need to, I wouldn't hesitate to replace it. Now while it's off the engine, I'll also clean off any dirt so it won't make its way inside the carb when we take off the bowl. After taking off the bowl, we can see some tiny specks of dirt, but nothing that would keep this carb from working. I'll spray off these specks and then replace the bowl. After that's back on, we can now take off the parts from the original engine so we can swap them over to replace the faded pieces. While I was taking off parts from this engine, I noticed that the emissions tube was cracked on the end. I was going to replace it with a new one as it's only a couple of dollars, but the other tube from the original engine is in great shape, so we'll just swap it over as well. It's pretty easy to replace, just pull the bad one out and push the good one in. So the carb still has the gasket that faces the metal plate, but our metal plate has its gasket on it from the missing carb. So it was a toss-up as to which one I wanted to keep, but in the end, I kept the one that was stuck to the carb. I'll keep the other gasket just in case I need it for this or another project. We can now install the carb to the used engine. The only thing I did not notice was that the plastic isolator that keeps the carb from making contact with the engine was also missing. So I had to take that one off the original engine as well. Having to line up all these components is kind of a pain, but it is not impossible. Now, before tightening the bolts, leave them loose. That way we have enough room to connect the emissions tube to the back of the airbox. If you do not connect this tube, the engine will have a way to breathe in unfiltered air, which will cause it to wear out prematurely. Now, after it's connected, you can then replace the last bolt. However, we may need to adjust the airbox, so do not tighten them just yet. The reason is that we need to make sure that the airbox's opening is not going to interfere with the choke flap. Once it's in a good position, we can then tighten the bolts. After the airbox is back on, we can now replace the fuel tank and the recoil assembly. Now, I don't think there's a difference in fuel tank sizes between the two engines, but if there is, I might consider swapping them later on. In a previous video, we serviced the recoil by taking out the spring, cleaning, and lubricating it. For some reason, this seems to happen a lot on Honda engines, but it's not hard to fix. Now, after putting it on the used engine, it seems to be working just fine. The last thing we need to do before we put it on the deck is to remove the clutch assembly. This is also when we find our first problem with this swap. And to be honest, I was actually expecting more problems with this swap because of the different engine sizes. The problem comes up when we try to mount the engine to the deck. After getting 3 of the 4 bolts in, it turns out the difference between the engines is one bolt is in a slightly different position. That's why this hole in this guard is slotted. That means we need to slot the hole in the deck so we can put the last bolt in. Now, could we get away with only 3 bolts? The answer, of course, is yes. However, I'm going to insist on putting the last bolt in. After slotting the hole, we can now try mounting the engine again. I didn't weigh them, but I think the larger engine is a few pounds heavier, which makes this job very tiring. If I do this again, I might try using the sawhorses to make installing the bolts a lot easier. The last thing to do is to reinstall the clutch cable bracket and then replace the clutch assembly. This would have been a great time to service the transmission fluid and examine the drive belt, but that wasn't the main reason for this video. Besides, when this engine was running, the self-propel system did not have any issues. In fact, it's the main reason why we're doing this swap. Everything on this mower was working just fine, and there was very little wear on it except the engine. Now, if the rest of the mower was in rough shape, I don't think I would even bother doing anything with it except using it for parts. I almost forgot to connect the clutch cable to the assembly. It's not a big deal as we can still do it right now, although it would have been a little bit easier if it wasn't already bolted to the shaft. After the cable is connected, try using the clutch to make sure that it's working like it's supposed to, then we can put it back on its wheels and make the last connections, and finally set the choke. Now, move the throttle lever to the off position so there's plenty of slack in the cable to make connecting it easier. Then put the end of the cable in its anchor and then position the cable so it will be located under its adjustable anchor, but don't tighten it yet. Next, move the throttle to the choke position and then move the cable in its anchor so that the choke flap is completely closed. Then you can tighten the anchor screw. So we have a slight issue. Part of the protective sheathing is missing, so the anchor will not hold the cable. To get around this, I'm going to use some rubber tubing so the anchor will grab the cable. After the cable is in position, move the throttle back and forth to make sure that the choke flap still closes all the way. You may have to make minor adjustments to get this to work right. Once the cable is set, we can now replace the air filter and its cover, put some oil in the engine, and some gas in the tank. Then we can finally try starting it, and hopefully we don't run into any issues. Now, when adding oil to your engine, take your time and make sure you do not overfill it. And when it comes to gasoline, try and use ethanol-free gas. And if it's not available in your area, try using additives to keep the ethanol from ruining your fuel systems. So it started just fine and the self-propel system works extremely well. I do have a few small issues though. The throttle lever wants to fall out of position and eventually moves to the stop position and the engine dies. So I might have to take a look at that and see why it's doing that. The other is it's not cutting very well. The reason seems to be worn out blades, so I might have to replace them in the future. Overall though, I'm extremely pleased with how this swap turned out. Another reason why this mower could be cutting poorly is that the dual blades might be in the wrong configuration. I didn't think this was possible, but I have seen this happen once before. Now these blades are in the right configuration, but the lift part of the lower blade is gone, so the mulching system isn't working like it's supposed to. So my question is, would you tackle an engine swap after watching this video, or do you think it should be left to people with more experience? Now most all mowers are about the same, only differing in the way the blades are connected to the shaft and how many bolts hold the engine to the deck, as most only use 3 while this Honda uses 4 bolts. Now personally, it's not that difficult, and in the end, you could turn 2 scrap mowers into 1 functional mower, so there'll be 1 less mower going to the landfill. Thank you for watching. I really appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask me any questions, and I hope to see you in the next video.